Hello, historians. Welcome to On This Day in History. On this day, because yesterday makes today and changes what happens tomorrow. So, a short look at what happened today on the 3rd of June. Keeping in mind, as always, this is not an all-encompassing look, just a selection of some of the important events of this day. So, 3rd of June in 1098. After 5 months of the First Crusade, Crusaders finally are able to take the city of Antioch. Now, this is actually in modern-day Turkey. So the First Crusade's first successful crusade was not even in the Holy Land. So an interesting fact to note. However, this was quite an important city to Christians at the time, as they believed this was going to be the launching pad for taking back the Holy Land, as it were. Now, in 1620, on this day, we finally get construction of the oldest church in North America, which was actually built by the French settlers in Quebec, in Canada. Interesting to note that before this time, there had been no formal permanent stone church built in all of the Americas, North or South. Just interesting to note that Christianity has only been there for 400 years, despite being around for 2,000. Interesting. Take note, any viewers in America. Anyway, in 1918, please note that this was an interesting development in a court case. There was a Supreme Court decision in Hammer versus Dagenhard that said you are not allowed to use child labor. You are not allowed to have children working in your factories or in your workshops or whatever it may be. They said this was unconstitutional. Now, obviously to us, we go, well, yeah, sure, of course. But this was quite a big decision. And as you can see, this was taken all the way to the Supreme Court. So that means this was decided in a lower court. And the company said, no, I want to have children in my factory, thank you. And it got appealed to the next court. And they lost again. No, I have to have children working in my factory. And they lost again, etc., etc. It goes all the way to the highest court in the land, the Supreme Court. And they said, no, actually, no, seriously, you cannot use children as your workers. And they went, oh. So they spent all of those thousands upon thousands of dollars just so that they could employ children in factories. How times have changed, I hope. In 1940, on this day, the 3rd of June, the last British and French troops are evacuated from Dunkirk. So keeping in mind the British soldiers that were there, the British Expeditionary Force, or BEF, had landed in France with the idea of trying to save France from falling to the Nazis. But with their blitzkrieg style of attack and tactics, use of modern technologies such as tanks and trucks and airplanes and air raids, the Germans were far too quick, far too powerful, and there was a chance that the BEF, the entire British Expeditionary Force, was going to be trapped, encircled, and captured in mainland France, which would have been a devastating blow to the war effort against the Nazis in World War II. But known as the Miracle of Dunkirk, somehow or other they managed to get not somehow or other, there's a deep dive into this in another episode, but they managed to get all of those soldiers, or the majority of those soldiers, home safely and able to fight on. And on this day in 1989, the Tiananmen Square Massacre begins. Now, this is technically today, technically tomorrow, and I will explain more because this is going to be our deep dive of the day. Now, whether you know what Tiananmen Square Massacre is, you've probably heard the phrase Tiananmen Square, or at the very least, you have seen this photo. It is one of the most iconic photos of all time, but especially of the 20th century, and especially of my lifetime. However, this infamous photo, the one you see all the time, I don't think is impressive enough. I actually prefer the wide view, which is this. If we look at that comparison, this looks mighty impressive. One man with his groceries standing up to 4 charging tanks. What a brave individual. Even more impressive. Look at all of those tanks. Look at all those soldiers ready to march in, and he is standing there alone. What a hero. So what was all of this about? Let's dive in. In actual fact, we have to start June 29th, 1981. Why? Because this gentleman, and again, I'm sure my pronunciation is perfect, Hu Yaobang became chairman of the Communist Party of China on this day. Why is that important? Well, it was his death 8 years later that would lead to the Tiananmen Square Massacre. How? Well, I'm glad you asked. What actually happened is this gentleman, who was a reformer, he wanted China to become more liberal, China to become more open, China to become more democratic in many ways. He was perhaps the Chinese equivalent of the Russian premier of the 1980s, Gorbachev, who was looking for a compromise between hardline communism and Western values, if you will. So, because he was looking to reform, hardliners, that means the people who are very, very strict, absolutely not. That's not what Chairman Mao, the founder of the Chinese communist state, would have wanted. There's no way we can ever change anything than what our dear leader wanted. This is terrible. Reform and change and adjusting to the times is the worst thing ever. We stay exactly the same always. That's how we make sure we're great. Obviously, I'm being facetious. So he was quite opposed by the hardliners in his own party. Now, what ends up happening is he dies of a heart attack, age 73, in April of 1989. So remember, we're making our way to June 3rd, 1989. So this takes place in April. Now, given the fact that he was so unpopular, people pressing against it, when he died, the official state response was basically to ignore it. Yeah, he died, whatever, moving on. Not give him any attention because they thought he might be a figure to inspire protest or inspire other people to pursue change. So there was no suggestion of a state funeral, despite the fact that he had been the chairman of the Communist Party, supposedly the most important person in China. But there was a response. We will see about that. The student body responded. So students in China who are learning about the world, who are learning about Western values, were thinking along the same lines as this gentleman that wanted reform in China. So all of a sudden, university students from all across Beijing marched on Tiananmen Square, calling for a rehabilitation of this gentleman's reputation. So people have been saying he was a criminal, he was awful, he was against the Communist Party. They said, absolutely not, that's terrible. We want him to be remembered as a hero. We want him to be remembered as a reformer. We want him to be remembered as pushing China forward to the future, those sorts of things. Now, interestingly enough, the slogans that they were chanting at this protest actually had to be officially approved by the Chinese Communist Party. So you're allowed to protest, but you're only allowed to protest if you say what we say you're allowed to say, which is interesting and where all of this develops. So how does that lead to this procession of tanks? Well, the party took notice of all of these protests and decided, you know what, why don't we give him a state funeral? We'll do the state funeral thing, and then that will calm down the protesters and we'll never have a problem again. That's not exactly what happened, but what they did end up having this funeral. So on the 22nd of April, 1989, they had this funeral, but that only rallied more protesters. Thousands of students all around Beijing begin protesting the Communist Party. Now, that ends up resulting in the leadership thinking, you know what, we've got to do something about this. So they publish an editorial, and it labels the protest only as Dongluan. Again, I'm sure my pronunciation is perfect. This means turmoil, basically rioting, and said they had been carried out by a tiny minority. So they essentially said, hey, all these people that are protesting China and thinking that we're too harsh on people and wanting more freedom, they don't really want that. They're all criminals. They're just rioters. They're just wanting to cause trouble. It's a good thing no one does that about protesters anymore in this modern world, and they actually listen to protesters and think they might have something to say and there might be a reason they're protesting. You don't just label them rioters and ignore what they have to say. Can you imagine if in 2020 people just ignored mass protest and thought they could just crush it down with authoritarianism? Can you imagine how silly you would look if in 2020 you were trying what the Chinese Communist Party tried in 1989? That would be ludicrous. I'm glad no one does that at all. So, of course, the response to this particular demonization, characterization of the protest only encouraged further protests. They are going to prove they're not a tiny minority. They speak for the majority, in fact. So that is what happened. Even more protests begin. People in other cities outside of Beijing, all across China, you get these protests. And so not only from students, all of a sudden, this idea, these ideas of progressing China, changing China, making it more modern, start spreading to other professions, so varieties of workers, housewives, doctors, even sailors from the Chinese Navy, which is really, really important because they are supposedly under the direct control of the Chinese Communist Party. So this is getting to be huge at this time. Over 1,000 of them took part, and it gained the movement widespread sympathy. Student leaders then called on protests to continue until June 20th, because that was the date of the next official meeting of the Chinese Communist Party. So what the idea was, we protest every single day up to this meeting, they'll have to take us seriously, and at that meeting, they will respond to our demands. That was the idea of the leaders of these protests. Keep up the pressure, public pressure, the power of the people, all of those ideas. Which brings us finally to this particular event. So alarmed at the prospect, alarmed at the idea that there would be protests all the way up to June 20th, they had to crack down. They couldn't do it on the 18th, 19th, or even the 20th of June, obviously, because that's far too close to the meeting. So they decided to crack down straight away. They were going to force all of these protesters out of Tiananmen Square. So, on foot and in tanks, firing tear gas, the army moved into the square on the morning of June 3rd, 1989, on this day. So they fired tear gas at peaceful protesters. Can you imagine if anyone in the modern world in 2020 did that to protesters? They just opened fire with tear gas and brought in the military, or threatened to bring in the military to disperse protesters. That would be outrageous. Can you imagine if someone did that? Oh, that'd be a nightmare. So the horror, the actual punishment and violence would get much, much worse the night of June 3rd. This is why I say, technically speaking, this is a June 3rd / June 4th event, because it takes place overnight. So throughout the early hours, on the overnight of June 4th, soldiers were beating, bayoneting, and shooting protesters. Many were crushed to death as tanks drove over them. No, I am not going to show you that footage, obviously. So this was a horrific event. By 6 a.m., so by the morning of June 4th, so overnight from June 3rd to June 4th, the square was cleared. This is what makes this completely and utterly so tragic. Doctors and ambulance drivers who tried to go in to help the injured protesters or see if they could save lives were also shot. Parents who were desperate, looking for their children who were students at the university to try and get them home, try and get them safe, were also shot. This was completely and utterly ruthless and crushed these peaceful protests. And so we are unable to know how many people actually died in this Tiananmen Square massacre. The reason for that being, you cannot necessarily trust, or you must take the official reports coming out of the Chinese Communist Party with a grain of salt, because of course they have a vested interest in undercounting the amount of people killed, because they don't want to seem too harsh, they don't want to seem too mean. So the official Chinese government figure is 241 people were killed, which is horrific enough, but other estimates can go from 800 to as many as 4,000 people killed by the state. Now, again, we do not know what the official number actually is, due to the cover-up, due to the absolute suppression of truth in this matter. But we know, at a bare minimum, the Chinese government admits to murdering 241 of their own citizens on this day in 1989. Now, this subject is taboo in China. You do not talk about it, and not just to be polite, but you literally can be arrested or charged or disappeared if you talk about it. Now, The Chinese government has done such a good job of making sure no one talks about this. Many young Chinese people know nothing about it. In fact, not just Chinese people, because of course there are many people who don't like to speak out against the Chinese government because maybe they have business interests over there. So oftentimes when you hear Tiananmen Square, that's all you hear, Tiananmen Square. It should officially be called the Tiananmen Square Massacre. Now, this is where we end up with how this affects today. As I say, the history of yesterday affects today, and we have to decide what's going to happen tomorrow. So much so that in the state of China, Tiananmen Square is banned by online search engines. So you cannot find this if you look it up in China. This video, for example, would not play in China. It would be banned. So you cannot even make references to the 3rd or 4th of June 1989. So they have censored words like tomorrow, that year, special day, many number combinations that could refer to the 4th of June 1989. 64, 64, 63 plus 1, 65 minus 1, and 35, shorthand for May 35th. All of those search terms are banned, okay? You do not talk about the so-called June 4th incident. It is not mentioned, completely and utterly censored. However, you will find some very, very clever protesters coming up with things such as this. This was a meme that went viral in China in 2013 and 2014 in the midst of the 25th anniversary of this event. So much so that this picture with the tank man standing up, which was replaced with rubber ducks, the term big yellow duck has also been banned. So you can't find this meme image in China anymore, which is ridiculous. As a matter of fact, for any TikTok users out there, the Chinese-owned video sharing app TikTok censors material that is politically sensitive to the Chinese government. Again, if I were to try and release this video on TikTok, first of all, who would watch it? But second of all, it would be taken down. It would be banned. Okay? Just keeping in mind, TikTok was actually launched in China in 2016 with the name Douyin. Again, I'm sure my pronunciation is perfect. And it had 100 million users in China by that time. But the beginning of this year, it has 500 million active users, 40% of which are outside of China, which means there is a lot of content being posted that the Chinese government is not able to control or is not able to keep track of. So TikTok is actually becoming a very, very, very useful platform in many ways to try and get messages into China that the government might censor. So keep all of that in mind in terms of how these events on this day are playing out in the world today. Keep in mind the sarcasm I was using, for example, when I refer to how no one would ever treat protesters as horribly as this because we've learned our lessons from history. Surely you would never see someone try and tear gas protesters or threaten to use the country's military on protesters. Who would do that, right? But also keep in mind that even what you do online today is influenced by this incident. So I hope you have had a moment to reflect and to think about how the effects of history affect the world we live in today and how hopefully we should apply the lessons of history to the world we live in today. So with all of that said, I hope you enjoy the rest of your